My brother kicked out 80-year-old grandma in a storm. What happened next shocked everyone. Please stay with me as I tell my story. And please, do not forget to support our channel by subscribing to our channel, liking our videos, and sharing your loved ones. Your support means the world to us. Now to our story. Poke. Imagine watching your own brother kick your 80-year-old grandmother out into a raging storm. It still makes my blood boil. My name is Rachel. I am 27 years old, and what I am about to share still feels unreal sometimes. My grandmother Margaret has always been the rock of our family. After my grandfather passed away years ago, she became the heart that held us together. She was gentle, wise, and never asked for much, just love and respect from her children and grandchildren. For most of my life, I lived in the same house as her. She was the person I could always turn to for advice or comfort when the world felt heavy. My parents had passed on when I was younger, so Grandma was more than just a guardian. She was my safe place, the one who reminded me that even after loss, family could still mean warmth and hope. But not everyone saw her that way. My older brother Ethan, who is 32, started changing in ways I never expected. Growing up, he was protective, someone I trusted. But after marrying Amanda, everything shifted. Amanda never cared for Grandma. She saw her as a burden, someone taking up space and resources that could have been theirs. I could see the way she frowned when Grandma's name came up, the way she rolled her eyes at her stories, and the way she whispered to Ethan when she thought no one noticed. At first, Ethan brushed off her complaints, but slowly, I noticed his attitude turning cold too. Where he once greeted Grandma with warmth, he began avoiding her. Where he once laughed at her stories, he now snapped, calling them pointless rambling. I tried to speak to him, to remind him of all she had done for us, but Amanda's voice seemed to carry more weight than mine. The house that once felt safe began to feel heavy with tension. Grandma, though hurt, tried to hide it. She kept smiling, kept offering love even when it wasn't returned. She would often tell me not to worry, that things would be okay, but I could see the pain in her eyes. I hated watching her be treated like she didn't belong in her own family's home. I never imagined Ethan could betray her so deeply, but soon I would see a side of him that broke me completely. That night during the storm changed everything for us, and nothing was ever the same again. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. Amanda's voice grew sharper with each passing week. She had a way of planting ideas in Ethan's head, making them sound reasonable even when they were cruel. She told him that Grandma was only holding us back, that an old woman in the house was dead weight and draining money we could be using for ourselves. Ethan didn't argue much anymore. He just nodded, letting her words settle in. Watching that happen felt like seeing him slowly drift further away from the person I used to know. Ethan stopped spending time with Grandma. He no longer asked how she was feeling or checked in on her like he once did. When she tried to make conversation, he acted distracted, as if her presence was an inconvenience. I could see how much it hurt her, even though she tried to hide it with a small smile. She was proud, but she wasn't blind. She knew something had changed. One night, the truth spilled out in the worst way. I was in my room when I heard raised voices from down the hall. Amanda was going on about how Grandma needed to be put in a nursing home, saying it would be better for everyone. She claimed the house was too small, that Grandma required more care than we could provide, though none of it was true. Ethan didn't protest. His silence said more than words could. What neither of them realized was that Grandma had heard every word. She had been sitting quietly in the living room when their argument carried through the walls. By the time I came out, she was sitting with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor. Her eyes were wet, though she wasn't crying out loud. The pain in her expression cut me deeply. She whispered that maybe Amanda was right, maybe she was a burden. I sat beside her and took her hand. I told her she wasn't a burden, that she was the heart of the family, and I would never let anyone push her away. I promised her I would never abandon her, no matter what Ethan or Amanda said. She squeezed my hand gently, trying to smile, but I could see the heaviness in her heart. Outside, the news kept warning about a dangerous storm approaching. The weather didn't just hang in the air. It pressed down on the house, thick and tense, like it knew something was about to break inside these walls. But instead of preparing for safety, the house was filled with cold silence. Amanda ignored Grandma completely, Ethan barely spoke, and the warmth that used to fill our home had vanished. I stayed close to Grandma that night, helping her get ready for bed, making sure she felt cared for. She thanked me softly, and I could hear the weariness in her voice. What I didn't know then was how quickly everything would come crashing down once that storm rolled in. The storm arrived with heavy rain and strong winds pounding against the windows. The house shook with every gust, and thunder rolled above us like the sky was ready to split open. Tension inside felt even louder than the storm outside. I was in the kitchen with Grandma when Ethan walked in, his face hard and tired. He barely looked at her before turning on me. We exchanged sharp words, one after another. I begged him to see reason, to stop treating Grandma like she was nothing, but the more I spoke, the angrier he became. His voice rose until it filled the room, his frustration spilling over. He shouted that I didn't understand, that I was only making things worse by standing in his way. Amanda stood nearby, watching the fight like it fueled her. Instead of calming him down, she pushed him further. She said Grandma wasn't his responsibility anymore, that he had a family of his own to care for now. She repeated the same bitter phrases she had used before, and I could see the way Ethan's jaw tightened each time she spoke. Her words wrapped around him, making him harder and colder by the second. Then, in one sudden moment, Ethan snapped. He grabbed Grandma's small suitcase, the one she always kept neatly packed with her few belongings, and dragged it toward the front door. My heart dropped as I realized what he was about to do. Grandma tried to speak, her voice trembling, asking what was happening, but he ignored her completely. The front door swung open, and the storm howled inside. Rain pelted the doorway, soaking the rug in seconds. Ethan lifted the suitcase and tossed it out into the downpour without hesitation. The sight froze me where I stood. Grandma's eyes filled with confusion and hurt as he turned toward her neck. I ran to him, begging him to stop, pleading with him to think about what he was doing. But he was too far gone. His anger twisted his face as he shouted at me. He said if I cared so much about Grandma, then I should take her and leave with her. His words cut deep, sharper than the lightning flashing outside. I turned toward Grandma, who stood quietly, clutching her shawl around her shoulders. She looked smaller than ever, standing in the doorway with the storm behind her. Her body shook from the cold wind rushing through the open door. The humiliation on her face broke me in a way I can't describe. Amanda crossed her arms and stayed silent, her eyes cold as stone. Ethan's chest rose and fell heavily, but he didn't take back a single word. That night, as the storm raged outside, I watched the woman who had given us everything stand shivering on the porch, thrown out of her own family's home by her own grandson. It was the moment I knew nothing between us could ever be the same again. The wind whipped across the porch, and rain poured down in heavy sheets. Without thinking, I ran to Grandma, wrapping my coat around her frail shoulders. She was shivering so badly I could feel her body trembling beneath my arms. I whispered that she wasn't alone, that I was here, and I would never let her stand out in the storm like that. She gave me a weak nod, but her face showed more sadness than fear. I hurried her down the steps, guiding her carefully to my car parked by the curb. My clothes clung to me, soaked through within seconds, but I didn't care. I opened the door and helped her inside, making sure she was safe before running around to the driver's seat. She clutched the coat tight, her lips pale, and her eyes staring straight ahead. I started the engine, my hands shaking, not from the cold but from the anger boiling inside me. As the rain hammered the windshield, I looked at her and tried to reassure her, but she spoke first. Her voice cracked as she apologized, saying she never wanted to be the reason for fights in the house. She said maybe if she had left sooner, things would have been easier for everyone. Hearing those words broke me more than anything Ethan had said. How could she blame herself for the cruelty of others? I reached over, held her hand, and told her firmly that she had nothing to be sorry for. The only people who should feel shame were the ones who put her in that position. In that moment, I made a decision. I wasn't going back inside that house. I wasn't going to keep living where kindness was treated as weakness and love was treated as a burden. That home wasn't safe anymore, it was poisoned. I knew leaving meant cutting ties with Ethan completely, but after what he had done, I couldn't imagine forgiving him. He had crossed a line that could never be repaired. Grandma didn't argue. She just leaned back in the seat, exhausted, as the storm raged on around us. I could still hear the thunder rumbling over the sound of the engine, but my focus stayed on the road as I pulled away from the driveway for the last time. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't need to. We drove through the storm slowly, the wipers barely able to keep up with the downpour. Grandma stayed quiet, holding onto my coat like it was the only thing keeping her warm. I squeezed her hand whenever I could, silently promising her that I wouldn't let her go through this pain again. By the time we reached a small motel on the edge of town, the storm had started to settle. I parked, walked her inside, and got us a room for the night. It wasn't much, but it was safe, and it was ours. For the first time in hours, I saw a hint of relief in her tired eyes. That night, as she finally rested, I sat awake, still shaking with anger, vowing I would never forget what Ethan had done. The morning after the storm, I knew there was no going back. I found a small rental apartment across town, nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom place with thin walls and old carpets. It wasn't much, but it was ours, and it meant Grandma would never have to feel unwanted again. I signed the lease and carried in what little we had. Most of our things fit into just a few boxes. Money became tight quickly. I had some savings, but it didn't last long with rent, groceries, and bills piling up. To make ends meet, I picked up a second job. During the day, I worked at the office, and in the evenings, I waited tables at a local diner. The hours were long, and some nights I came home exhausted. But when I saw Grandma waiting for me, it felt worth it. She would always smile, no matter how late it was, asking if I had eaten before she handed me a plate of food she had saved. Grandma refused to sit idly by. She told me she wanted to contribute, even if only in small ways. She started cooking not just for us, but for neighbors too, often trading meals for little favors. On weekends, she took out her sewing machine, mending clothes for people at church or making small blankets. Before long, she began selling her quilts at the church fairs. People admired her work, and it gave her a sense of pride. She would hand me the small bills she earned, insisting it helped. I never argued, though I hated seeing her work at her age. Still, it made her happy, and that mattered. Through it all, our bond grew stronger. Even in the smallest apartment, I felt more peace with her than I ever had in that big house filled with anger. We shared meals at the kitchen table, laughed over silly stories, and sometimes just sat quietly watching the world go by from the window. Those moments reminded me of the love that still existed in our family, the kind of love Ethan had chosen to throw away. But deep down, I carried a weight I couldn't shake. Every night, when the lights were off and Grandma was asleep, my thoughts turned to Ethan. I replayed the storm in my mind, the sight of him throwing her suitcase out, his words telling me to leave if I cared so much. Anger stayed inside me like a fire that refused to burn out. Grandma noticed, of course. She always did. One evening, she sat me down and told me I shouldn't waste my life carrying hate. She reminded me that bitterness only takes from the one who holds it. She said forgiveness was the only way forward, not for Ethan's sake but for mine. I listened, but I couldn't agree. I nodded, yet inside I still felt the sharp edge of betrayal. I wanted to protect her, to honor her, but letting go of that anger felt impossible. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget, and I wasn't sure I ever wanted to. Months passed, and life settled into a routine. I worked long hours, and Grandma kept busy with her sewing and cooking. We didn't have much, but our home was filled with peace. Then news about Ethan began to spread. His investments, the ones he always bragged about, started to fail. At first, I ignored the rumors, but soon I heard that he had lost a large amount of money. Bills were piling up, and the house he and Amanda were so proud of was in danger of being taken away. Amanda didn't handle it well. She had always enjoyed the comforts of their lifestyle, and the thought of losing it all made her desperate. I wasn't surprised when Ethan suddenly reached out to me. His message came under the disguise of wanting to reconnect, to fix things between us. He acted as though the past could be brushed aside, as if I had forgotten what he had done during the storm. When I met him for coffee, his words were sweet, but his eyes gave him away. He asked about Grandma, if she was doing well, if she needed anything. The questions weren't born out of care. I could sense the reason behind them. He was fishing for information. He wanted to know if she had money, if there was anything left that could help him climb out of the mess he had made. I kept my answers short, refusing to let him see through me. Still, that meeting stayed with me, leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. I hated that he thought he could pretend nothing had happened, that he believed I would hand over help just because he asked. A few nights later, while helping Grandma with her medicine, I told her about Ethan's sudden attempt to reconnect. She listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. After a long pause, she looked at me and revealed something I hadn't expected. Years ago, before Grandpa passed away, he had left her a small inheritance. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to make a difference if used wisely. Ethan didn't know about it, and Grandma never told him because she feared it would be wasted. Her eyes were steady as she spoke to me. "Use it wisely, child," she said. "Don't let bitterness guide you, but never let them trample us again." Her words stayed with me, carrying both love and warning. She didn't want me to waste my life chasing revenge, but she also didn't want me to allow Ethan to take from us what he didn't deserve. That night, I lay awake thinking about everything. I realized the power I held, not just the inheritance, but the choice of how to use it. Ethan had made his decisions, and now he was paying the price. I wasn't going to let him use Grandma again. Whatever came next, I would make sure her trust wasn't broken a second time. I thought about Grandma's words for days. She trusted me with something precious, and I knew exactly what I had to do. Instead of wasting the inheritance trying to fix Ethan's mistakes, I decided to use it to build a better life for us. After weeks of searching, I found a small but beautiful house on the edge of town. It wasn't large, but it had a garden, a cozy kitchen, and enough space for Grandma to move around comfortably. The day we moved in, Grandma stood in the yard with tears in her eyes. She touched the porch railing and smiled like she hadn't in years. For the first time since the storm, I saw true peace on her face. She planted flowers by the walkway, baked pies for the neighbors, and slowly became part of the community. People respected her, admired her strength, and welcomed us with open arms. Watching her thrive filled me with pride. Meanwhile, Ethan and Amanda's situation only grew worse. Their debts piled up, and their once perfect life began to crumble. Word spread quickly, and soon people whispered about their downfall. Desperate, they started asking around about Grandma. Amanda, especially, became convinced that Grandma had hidden money, something they believed should have been theirs. They asked relatives, even neighbors, if anyone knew what she had left behind. Their desperation made them reckless. One afternoon, without warning, Ethan and Amanda showed up at our new house. I answered the door, and the look on their faces told me everything. They had expected to find us struggling in some rundown apartment, clinging to survival. Instead, they saw Grandma sitting on the porch in her rocking chair, dressed neatly, smiling as she greeted a neighbor walking by. She looked strong, healthy, and happy. The shock in Ethan's eyes was clear. He stood frozen, taking in the sight of the life we had built without him. Amanda's face twisted with resentment, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the house and the yard. I could almost hear her thoughts. This was what she believed belonged to them, what Ethan should have secured. They didn't stay long. The air between us was heavy, filled with everything unspoken. Ethan didn't ask for money directly, but the look in his eyes was enough. He knew he had lost not only financial security, but also the trust of the only family who would have stood by him. Amanda walked away with anger written all over her face, blaming him for failing to take what she thought was theirs. When the door closed behind them, I felt no guilt. Instead, I felt stronger. Ethan's choices had brought him here, and no amount of pretending could erase what he had done. Grandma and I were finally safe, living a life built on love and respect, not greed. And Ethan had to live with the truth, that he had thrown it all away. It was a gray afternoon when Ethan finally came to see me alone. He looked thinner, older, as if the weight of his choices had drained the life out of him. His clothes were wrinkled, and there was no pride left in his posture. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize the brother I had once looked up to. He stood at the door, shifting nervously before asking if we could talk. I let him in, and we sat at the kitchen table. Grandma was in the living room, knitting quietly, close enough to hear but giving us space. Ethan avoided my eyes at first, staring down at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. He admitted he had made mistakes, that he had let things get out of control. He said Amanda was gone, their home was gone, and now he didn't know where else to turn. His words carried shame, but also a hidden hope, that I would forgive, that I would help. For a long moment, I said nothing. I wanted to see if his apology came with true regret or just desperation. He eventually asked if Grandma had any savings left, anything that could help him get back on his feet. The question told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't about rebuilding family, it was about money. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. There was no point in yelling. I looked at him steadily and reminded him of the night of the storm. I told him how I could still see Grandma standing in the rain, shivering while he threw her suitcase into the mud. I told him how he had looked me in the eye and said I should take her and leave if I cared so much. My voice was steady, but the weight of those words filled the room. Ethan dropped his head, unable to look at me. He didn't try to argue or defend himself. For once, he had no excuses. I leaned forward and spoke the truth he needed to hear. You made your choice that night. Now live with it. The silence that followed was heavy. Ethan finally lifted his head, and for the first time, I saw defeat in his eyes. He realized in that moment that he hadn't just lost money or a house. He had lost his family. The bridge he had burned couldn't be rebuilt. Grandma set down her knitting and looked over at us. She didn't speak, but the dignity in her silence said more than words could. She didn't need to remind him of his betrayal. The memory itself was punishment enough. Ethan stood slowly, thanked me in a voice barely above a whisper, and walked out. I watched him leave, feeling no triumph, only a quiet certainty. He had destroyed his own place in this family, and now he had to live with the consequence. Ethan's life unraveled quickly after that. His marriage, already strained by debt and constant fighting, couldn't hold together any longer. Amanda had grown tired of the struggle, and in the end, she chose herself. One morning, she packed her things, took what little money remained in their account, and walked out without looking back. Ethan was left alone in the echo of an empty house, abandoned by the person he had once chosen over his own blood. With bills overdue and creditors closing in, the house he had once been so proud of slipped through his fingers. The bank repossessed it, and Ethan had no choice but to move into a small, rundown apartment on the edge of town. The place was cramped, with peeling paint on the walls and a leaky faucet that dripped through the night. It was a far cry from the comfortable life he once flaunted. Bitter and lonely, he kept to himself, carrying the weight of his downfall everywhere. While Ethan sank further into despair, Grandma and I built something new together. Our little house became a haven of warmth and laughter. She filled the kitchen with the smell of fresh bread and pies, while I worked hard to keep everything running smoothly. On Sundays, we welcomed neighbors and friends, sharing meals and stories. Slowly, our home grew alive with love, the kind of love money could never buy. The community noticed. People admired the way I cared for Grandma, never leaving her side, always making sure she was comfortable. At church gatherings and local events, others would quietly tell me how lucky Grandma was to have me, though I always felt it was the other way around. She gave me strength, wisdom, and a kind of peace that only comes from being truly loved. Together, we stood tall despite everything we had lost. Ethan's story traveled through the same community, but in whispers. His name was often spoken with pity, sometimes with judgment. People remembered the night of the storm, how he had turned his back on the woman who raised him. They saw the contrast clearly. While Grandma thrived and found respect, Ethan was left with nothing but regret. The shame followed him, even when he tried to avoid it. I never celebrated his downfall, but I couldn't ignore the justice in it. Life had given back to us what he had tried to take away. Grandma's dignity was restored, and my bond with her became unshakable. Meanwhile, Ethan had destroyed his own happiness with the choices he made. At night, when I sat beside Grandma on the porch, watching her rock gently in her chair with a blanket over her knees, I felt grateful. The storm that had once threatened to tear us apart had instead cleared the path for something better. We were safe, we were loved, and we were finally at peace, while Ethan was left to sit in the silence of the life he had chosen. The years that followed were gentle ones. Grandma grew older, but her spirit stayed strong. She spent her days tending to the garden, sewing gifts for neighbors, and telling me stories I never grew tired of hearing. Her laughter filled the house, and even on the hardest days, she found a way to remind me of hope. But time moves on, and eventually her body began to grow weaker. She never complained, only smiled and told me she had lived a full life. One quiet morning, I found her resting peacefully in her bed, her hands folded neatly, her face calm. She had slipped away in her sleep, leaving behind nothing but love and memories. My heart broke, yet at the same time, I felt grateful she had gone without pain. She left me with more than her quilts and recipes. She left me with strength, the kind that would carry me through the rest of my life. Her funeral was simple but beautiful. People from the community came to honor her, filling the small church with warmth. They spoke about her kindness, her wisdom, and the way she had touched so many lives. I listened quietly, holding on to every word, proud that she had been my family, my anchor. Ethan came, standing in the back, looking worn and defeated. His face carried the years of regret that no apology could erase. When our eyes met, he looked as if he wanted to say something, but I turned away. I didn't let guilt creep into my heart. He had made his choice that night in the storm, and there was no undoing it. This day wasn't about him. It was about honoring the woman who had given us everything. As I stood by her grave, watching the flowers being laid gently on top, I reflected on everything we had been through. The storm that night hadn't just torn through the town. It had torn through our family, stripping away illusions and exposing the truth. It showed me who cared and who didn't, who would stand firm and who would walk away. Ethan betrayed blood, but in the end, I found family in the bond Grandma and I shared. Her love had carried me when I was lost, and even though she was gone, her strength lived on in me. I realized then that revenge was never the answer. I didn't need to see Ethan suffer or punish him for what he had done. Life had already done that. The best revenge wasn't anger or bitterness. It was the life Grandma and I built together, full of dignity and peace. As I left the cemetery, I felt her presence with me, soft and steady like a hand on my shoulder. She had always told me not to waste energy on hate, and now I finally understood. The real victory was living well, holding my head high, and letting those who had wronged us destroy themselves with their own choices.